So today you probably noticed that we are talking about drones. Yeah, I'm Henry. In this channel I help you with the tech tools to be creative, and today we're talking about the best video settings for your DJI drone. So mainly I'm going to be talking about the DJI AIR2S, and the screen you're going to be seeing from the phone and from the controller are from this drone over here. But anyways, many of the tips applies also to other DJI drones. So we're going to be talking about camera settings, which profile to use to have the largest dynamic range possible, which codec to use, and how to configure each one of them to have the best performance possible with your drone. Now the resolution is something that you might be tempted to shoot at the same size of the file that you want to export or that you normally work with. But there's a big advantage on shooting in the higher resolution possible. And that is because in the end you're gonna have a bigger picture for a smaller canvas, meaning that you can reframe the shot the way that you want. You could also create some movement that wasn't there initially, like for example panning sideways or pushing in or out, or even use this to do one of those cool dolly zoom effects. But even if you don't want to do any of these and you just want the best image possible, it's still better to record in the highest resolution, like for example on the Air2S, recording at 5.4K and then scaling down to 4K or to 1080p, whatever you prefer, and the image is going to be even sharper than originally shot in that resolution. So if you don't have one of the drones that you can actually change the aperture, you're gonna have to rely on the ND filters that come with it, or you're gonna have to get a separate package just because of that. And now you're gonna have two choices. You have the lazy choice, which is ignoring the ND filters and simply cranking the shutter all the way up until your exposure is just right. And the other one is gonna be turning on the drone, taking a look at how the exposure is right now if you set the shutter at double your frame rate, and then attaching the appropriate ND filter for that situation. Now this can be really boring because many times you're gonna end up sticking in the wrong ND filter and it's gonna be either still too bright or too dark. So let me quickly show you an app that is gonna help you calculate while you're still on the ground. Okay, so let's see how the app works. Just download ND Expert, and in the menu, instead of choosing drone, which can actually be quite confusing, just go to the normal ND filter calculation. Now all you need to do is to input the configuration you have right now that is granting the correct exposure, which probably has a very high shutter speed. And below, you're gonna put which one do you want about aperture and also shutter. And like this, it's gonna tell you which kind of ND filter below you actually need it. Just remember that when you're calculating it and you have the drone on the ground, it's still probably gonna be a little bit darker than it is going to be up there. So be sure to include a little bit of margin for this, and if you're in doubt, just use one lower, because you can always increase a little bit the exposure, but you cannot take it away anymore if you already reached the limit of twice the frames per second, or you're already at 100 ISO and you don't want to be coming back and forth with the drone, especially if you don't have much time. Now let's talk dynamic range and color. Now, if you just want the fastest workflow possible, the best way to go is to just use the base profile, and that's it. You're mostly not gonna need any kind of color, but your dynamic range is gonna be the lowest one possible amongst all options you have. In some drones, you're gonna have the option to use HLG, and that one is really good to preserve especially the highlights on a scene that is very contrasty. Even if it looks almost blown out, you're still gonna be able to recover those highlights and still see a little bit of the clouds or anything that was around a very bright spot. But the best way to go and to have the largest dynamic range possible is to shoot in D-Log. And this is a way in which the drone records all the luminosity of the scene in a different manner that actually preserves better, not only the shadows but also the highlights. And in the cases like the Air2S, Mavic 2 Pro or the Mavic 3, it unleashes also the option to use 10-bit color in your footage. And this will be especially useful when you're editing colors afterwards. But the difference is in how far can you go with it and also the quality of the final result. Now many people associate log with being really difficult to color grade and just like opting to go with the base profile because they don't have the time for it. I'm gonna leave two LUTs in the description below that are gonna help take your log footage, all gray like this, to the Rec 709 color space, which is the standard, in 1 second. Now these are not going to add any kind of special look to your image. You're just gonna use these to take the colors back to where they should, and then you can tweak a little bit with the exposure, contrast and saturation just to have everything looking good, to then start changing a little bit the colors if you want to. Alright, so using the LUTs I'm providing is very simple. I'm gonna show you really quickly how to do it in Premiere Pro and DaVinci. In Premiere, you just have to drag your clip into the timeline and add a lumetri color effect. Then go to the Creative tab, and there just go to Browse, find the LUT over there and apply it on your footage. Now it's going to be converted to Rec 709 and you can begin color grading from here. On DaVinci, you have to add the LUT first into the software. So you can just go to the settings over here, and then you can go to color management. You're going to see the LUTs folder down here. So you can just open it, drag the LUT over inside this folder the way you prefer. And then going back to DaVinci, you can just refresh the LUTs. Now go to the color page, add one simple node, and right clicking, you're already gonna see LUT, and your LUT is gonna be over there. Now if you're shooting D-Log, you're gonna see that the screen turns out to be a little bit gray, which can make it a little bit difficult to fly or to identify some objects while you're flying. So if you just wanna change that and just wanna have an idea of how it's gonna look after the edit, you can just go to the menu and turn on the Color Display Assist. This is just going to apply some sort of LUT onto the footage for you to see how it can look like. But in the back, it's still recording as the flat profile, and when you throw it in the computer, you're gonna see that everything is in that flat gray profile for you to color grade it. Now this one seems obvious, but so many people forget about it, and then it's a pain later in the editing, which is leaving the white balance in automatic. Now when you're shooting photos, you have a significant bigger amount of colors that you can work with, and it's much easier to change the white balance. It almost doesn't matter anymore if you shoot in RAW. But shooting video is completely different. You really have to pay attention to it, and especially because the camera is in motion, the camera is going to be recalculating the white balance at all times. And even if the newer DJI drones do a very good job at it, it's just something that you don't need to deal with later in the color editing. What I usually like to do is to leave it around 5500 Kelvin during daytime, and then adjust from there according to the situation. Set everything to Pro or manual mode. So the same way you're gonna have it on a normal camera, the drone is gonna have all the configurations like a proper camera, in the sense that you can control the shutter, aperture, ISO, all of these in the manual mode, meaning that you can set them the way that you want and not let it decide what to do with it. So first let's talk about the shutter, and this is something that you should leave always around 2 times the amount of frames per second that you're recording. Meaning, for example, that if you're configuring the drone to film at 25p, meaning 25 frames per second, you should probably leave the shutter at around 1/50. And this is going to apply for any other frames per second that you configure. So let's say, for example, that you're recording at 4K 60 with this drone, you're going to want a shutter higher, equal or higher than 1/120. And this is to avoid footage that looks a little bit jittery, and also to have the perfect amount of motion blur for that configuration. Second, let's talk about the ISO, and this is something that you definitely don't want to leave in automatic, because it's so easy to not notice that the drone is just like cranking it up all the way. And just to have everything well exposed, you're going with ISOs over 400, 800. But even with these guys having each time bigger sensors, like the Air2S having a 1-inch sensor or the Mavic 3 having a 4/3 sensor, it's always good to leave this ISO maximum 400, let's say. So it's better to pay attention to that and control it yourself. Now the aperture is something that you not always have the control of, because many of these drones from DJI, they do not have a variable aperture, meaning that you cannot change it. This is one of the big advantages of the Mavic 2 Pro or the Mavic 3, for example. And the aperture is something that when you're using a normal camera, you really want to control it well because of 2 things. One is because of the amount of light that enters the camera, but the second one is because it also controls the depth of field, meaning how much of your scene is going to be blurry or how much is going to be in focus. But since usually the drone is very far away from the subject it's filming, it's hardly noticeable the difference in apertures. So it's really handy to have the control on the aperture just to control the luminosity. Now the amount of frames per second that you choose to have on your footage is going to dictate how much can you slow it down later on in post-production. Normally, you're gonna have a timeline of 24, 25 or 30 frames per second, for example. And then if you have 2 times, 3 times more this because you shot it at, let's say, 100 frames per second, on a 25 timeline, you're gonna be able to slow it down 4 times or until 25%. A lot of people ask why not to shoot everything in the highest amount of frames per second possible. By respecting the rule of having twice the shutter speed of the amount of frames per second you're recording, you're really limiting yourself. Let's say, for example, you're shooting in blue hour and you want to do it at 100 frames per second. Having the shutter at 200 might just not be enough for you to have the right exposure in camera. So the best thing is to choose why you're shooting, what you want to do with it later. By the way, in the Air2S, for example, and in some other drones, some of the frame rates are only available in another mode. Like in this one, for example, you only can access 1080p at 120 frames per second using the slow motion option beside video, which is also video recording, but it's on a separate part. I don't know why. Now, some of the DJI drones actually allow you to choose which kind of codec do you want to record at. And usually it's just MP4, H.264, and you can't really change that. Other ones, like the Air2S, offer you to shoot in MP4 or MOV, and H.264 or H.265. The higher codecs, they use the H.265, which is a bit more compressed. It's a really high quality codec, and it's a little bit heavier to edit later on. But if your computer can handle it, it's totally recommended. The best you're gonna get with prosumer drones is the ProRes from the Mavic 3 Cine, but for that one you're gonna have to spend $5,000 minimum. The overexposure warning or zebras is really useful for you to have a perfect idea of what is being overexposed and what is okay. It can feel a little bit stupid because after all you're seeing in your phone what is going on, but actually some things, like for example when you have a really bright sky with clouds, it's difficult to pinpoint if the clouds are being clipped or not. So with the zebras you can just be sure that everything is okay and you don't have to find it out later in the edit. In case you decided to use the manual focus, the peaking settings are going to be very helpful for you because they're just going to overlay some sort of yellow or red dots all over the place where the focus is. And this is really going to make much easier for you to identify where the focus is and where to shift it to have exactly as you want it. Now, regarding grids, there are many different options and you can choose the ones that you prefer the most. I like to have only the rule of thirds grid on top of the screen so that I can have an idea of composition, but that I can still see all the image really clearly, especially when I'm moving the drone around. But this is mostly what works for you. Now, regarding the frequency, there's a lot of misconception out there. Some people say you should leave it at 2.4, some people say that you have to change it to 5 GHz, and by what I tested, the best configuration is always to leave it in auto. And this is because the main difference between them is the range and the bandwidth. 2.4 is going to offer you a little bit more range, but at a limited bandwidth. And 5 GHz is going to have a really high bandwidth, but a little bit less range. So if you leave it in automatic, the drone is going to use the information from the scanning that it's doing all the time about which frequencies are more free and which ones have less interference. So let's imagine you're still flying relatively close to you and there are so many other devices using the 2.4 GHz frequency around. In this case, since you don't really need the range and there's a lot of interference, the drone might choose to use the 5 GHz frequency for better performance. But the moment you start flying away, and like this the interference from other devices start reducing, the drone can now switch for a configuration that uses a little bit better the range, in this case the 2.4 GHz frequency. So just leave it automatic. Now this is a pro tip, especially with the Air2S, many of the menus are only accessible when you're actually flying. So if you choose a new mode of recording, just go to the menu to check especially which kind of resolution are you filming. The standard usually comes at 1080p, but you can always swap it to 4K. You have no idea how much footage I got at 1080p because I didn't know this before. One choice you're gonna have to make is about using PAL or NTSC, and this depends on where in the world you live. And this is going to affect which kind of standard it's used in your country and which kind of frame rates are gonna be available in your drone. So check it before flying to have the perfect settings for your area. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget the LUTs in the description below to help you out with the color grading of your drone footage. If you have any doubts about drones, just write them in the comment section below and I'm gonna be sure to answer all of you. And if you don't follow me on Instagram or Twitter, do so. Like this, you can have a little bit more direct contact with me and see the production of these videos. Alright, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao! Hey, thanks again for watching, and in case you don't have a DJI Air2S but you're thinking about maybe getting one, check out this video over here where I explain everything that you can do with this bad boy. Alright, see you!